Today I'm going to be talking to you about .NET. So I'm going to be running through a very little bit of theory, so I don't put you to sleep. And then we're going to go into a practical example. So I'm going to code and I want you to follow along in the code with me. And if you get stuck anywhere, please just put up your hand, and if I don't see you, shout, and either me or Mike or Rory will come and help you. Who of you here have experience in C#? Okay, so we have a few people. The others, what kind of languages have you done? Anyone? Nothing? No coding at all? Java? Okay. JavaScript? There's one person. People with JavaScript. A few there. Cool. Alright. Okay, well, C# is not a very difficult language to learn. And the .NET framework is based on C#. So this is a little picture of the history of the .NET framework. And it started out with .NET 1.0 back in 2002. Now, does anyone here know why it was called .NET? No. Exactly. So the dot in the beginning makes files in Linux invisible, and the legend is that they didn't want Linux users to use the .NET framework. That's why they put a dot in front. But then a couple of years ago, they released .NET Core, which is the cross-platform version. And that's the one we're actually going to be using today, because I actually have a Mac. So I wouldn't be able to show you .NET Framework anyway. But that's not the only reason we're using it. So .NET Core is a much more lightweight version of .NET Framework. It has a whole lot of extra similar things to the .NET Framework, but it brings a few more things as well. And it's a little bit easier to use and get set up with. .NET Framework doesn't have a place in the world anymore. For large corporate applications, you would find that .NET Framework still suits better, but .NET Core is a good place to get started. So you can see the history there. The one that's missing is 2017, when .NET Core 2.0 was released. Now with .NET Core 2.0, they also released something called .NET Standard. .NET Standard is something where they're trying to standardize everything across all of the different frameworks that .NET provides. So we have .NET Framework, we have .NET Core, and we also have Xamarin. Xamarin is for mobile applications. And with the help of .NET Standard 2.0, there are certain libraries which can now be used across all three, making it easier to code in one place but be able to use it everywhere. Who here knows XKCD? This is a little comic that someone edited to fit the .NET platforms a little bit more. So there's 14 complete stacks. We need to develop a universal stack, and soon afterwards we have 15 complete stacks. So that's how .NET has been going for a very long time. And you'll see tomorrow when we do Java, for those of you who are attending the Java and Spring one tomorrow, that even that is kind of similar to what we're going to be learning today. So with .NET Core, we're going to be using something called MVC. Anyone know what MVC is? Okay, a few people know what MVC is. Okay, well, it's an architectural pattern, and it separates the parts of an application into three groups: the models, the views, and the controllers. And the picture looks kind of like this. You can see over there we have model, controller that talks to the model and the views, and the view that displays the model. So we're going to be creating a .NET Core MVC application. So let's get started. Okay, once you're on this screen, you're going to hit Control and tilde. And you're going to get a terminal that looks something like this. Yours will probably be in PowerShell. If you don't want to use PowerShell, you can use PowerShell if you want to. If you don't want to use PowerShell, you can hit the plus over there and it will pop up with a bunch of settings. And you can choose Git Bash. So once you're in your terminal, pick a directory where you want to store your stuff, maybe on the desktop or wherever you'd like to store everything. And inside that directory, make a new one called Course Management. And then go into that directory. Now we're going to inside the course management directory. Remember, you have to be inside the course management directory. So you have to have typed cd course management. Right? Now we're going to use the .NET CLI to create our .NET app. So to do that, we're going to type .NET new MVC and hit enter. So now, as we all type this at the same time and hit enter, we're all going to spam the router, and the internet is going to slow down a little bit. But that's okay. So what this does is it's going to create a kind of shell for our application, an MVC one. With the .NET CLI, you can create a bunch of different kinds of apps. It doesn't have to be an MVC one. There we go. Eventually it will say restore succeeded. Once it says restore succeeded, you can close your terminal. And then hit open folder. And navigate to this folder that we just created, this course management folder. So mine is in this directory called UFS. And it's course management, and I'm just going to hit open. Once you open the folder, for some of you, you may have seen a little pop-up that says add required assets to build. If you see that pop-up, hit yes. This one, mine just popped up. So, not everyone's going to see it, so I'm going to say not now so I can show you what to do if you don't see it. Alright. So to those of you who see it, hit yes and they'll be sorted. To those of you who didn't see it, hit this little bug icon over there and then the cog over here. And it will pop up with this menu. And we're going to select .NET Core. That will create this launch.json file. This file is what we're going to use to launch our application using Visual Studio Code. Once your launch.json is created, it gets opened up. Just make sure that this is like this. So the program part is set to this. Now, again, open up the little bug there and hit the play button. Some of you may get a little pop-up that says you don't have tasks set up. You'll see one of the options in that pop-up will be configure tasks. Do that one. If not, if this works, we're going to, once it's done building, get our app. Let's see. I should have hit play a little while ago while I was helping people. So, Rory told me that some of them are opening up in Edge, and it might not work in Edge, so what you should rather do is open up Google Chrome and go to localhost :5000. So this is the default app that the .NET CLI created for us. We're going to make a few changes to this one. But with Visual Studio Code, we get a little bit of an easier way to run our apps after we create our launch.json. So over here we have a rebuild, a stop, a pause. You can hit stop once we get to this point. Now, just a quick look at what all got created for us. So we have this .vs code folder, which has our launch and tasks.json. That's what lets us use that play button to start up our app in Visual Studio Code. The bin folder is where all of our build files go. So after everything builds, it goes inside the bin folder. Then we have a controllers folder, a models folder, and a views folder. Those are the three important ones and the three we're going to be working in. So MVC pattern, models, views, and controllers. We're going to be creating a few models, a few views, and a few controllers. Then another important file over here is this startup.cs file. This is what starts up our .NET application. And inside the startup.cs, there are two important methods, and we're going to talk a bit more about them just now when we actually start creating our database. So for our database, we're going to use an in-memory database, which means that every time you restart your app, the things will disappear and you have to re-add them again. But we'll be using something called Entity Framework Core. Entity Framework Core comes with .NET Core, and using that, it's quite easy to switch to an actual real database. It's an ORM, and it will take our database memory objects and create them into classes for us in C#. Right. So let me just check. So what we're going to do is build a little course management app for UFS. So in our models, we're going to create a new file. So to do that, you click on the models folder, and you can either click on the new file button up here, or you can right click on models and say new file. And our first model is going to be called course.cs. CS stands for C#, and that's what all of our class files in C# will be called. Now in C# we have namespaces. Our namespace usually follows the convention of the project name, then dot the folder that this file is in. So in our case it will be course management dot models. And to define a class, we're going to define it as public, first of all. And we're going to use the keyword class. And again, the convention is to name your class the same as what you named your file. So our class will be called course. All right. Our course class will have three properties. Now, a shortcut for creating properties in Visual Studio Code is to just type the word prop and then push tab. That creates the property for you. The first property we're going to have is a long, and it's going to be the ID of our class. Now with Entity Framework Core, when you create an ID like this, it will make it an auto-incrementing ID straight away for you. So you don't have to worry about keeping track of it yourself. Right. Our next property will be a string, and we'll call it name. property, which will also be a string, and we'll call it level. So there's our first class. Let's create one more class. We're going to call the second class student. It's going to be in the same namespace. Because it's in the same folder. And its name will be student. Student will also have an ID. Student will also have a name. And student will have an integer, which will be year. Now that we have our two classes, we're going to use Entity Framework to create our database. Now, one thing that's nice with .NET Core, I had a question in the front here, is Entity Framework Core the same as Entity Framework in the normal .NET? It's similar, but Entity Framework Core comes bundled with .NET Core, which means that if you click on the actual project over here, this file over here called .csproj, that's the project file. Over here, you can see that it's including a reference to something called microsoft.aspnetcore.org. So this is including all of the helper files that .NET Core comes with, and Entity Framework is one of those helper files. To create our database, we need to create a database context. To do that, we're going to add one more file to the models folder and call it course context.cs. Again, it's a C# file, so it's .cs. It's going to be again in the same namespace. And it's also going to be a class, because everything in C# is some sort of object. So it's usually a class or a struct. Now, in order to make this a database context, we're going to inherit from another class that's built into Entity Framework Core. And this other class is called DB Context. Now, when you type in DB Context, you'll see that it's immediately underlined with a red line, because we haven't imported, or we haven't told where this class where to find DB Context, in what namespace it exists. Again, an easy thing with Visual Studio Code, instead of having to type it, we can click on this little light bulb in the corner, and you'll see the top one says using Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. And if you hit that, you'll see it added to the top of your page. So this is saying that we're using this other namespace which exists in the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core namespace. And that's where DB Context lives. Another way to fix this problem is to type out the full name in front of DB Context here. So Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.DB Context. But that gets a little bit verbose if you need to use it multiple times. Once we have our DB context, we're going to create a constructor in our class. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit. Do that. Alright. So this is a constructor which says that our context is going to be defined by this course context. And the other thing we need to add to this context are what properties we actually want to have in our database. We're going to have two of those. We're going to have courses and students, because those are the two classes we created. We're defining courses as a database set of course, and students as a database set of student. So while everyone's typing, I'm going to explain this part over here that says base. So we're inheriting from a class called DB context, and what this base options over here is doing is it's calling the constructor of the class we're inheriting from and passing the same options that this constructor is receiving. Once we have our course context, we need to register it. Now, we're going to go back to this startup file over here, and inside the public class startup, we're going to delete everything except for this configure method at the bottom. Everything above it, we're going to delete. So leave the configure method as is. Don't touch that one. Okay? And once we delete that part, we're going to add a new method. We're going to recreate the configure services method that we just deleted. So, let me just put this on multiple lines. Right. So our new configure services method is going to add this course context as the database context, the main database context of our app. So we still have some red lines over here after we type all of this in. And I'm going to use the little light bulb again to add in my using statements. This name over here in the inverted commas, this string name, this is what I've chosen to name my database. So you could choose to name your database something else, but I just named mine that so that I could remember what to type. And you can see the command use in-memory database. So if you were using a real database, this is where you would change that. So you would use your SQL Server database. So that's our model setup and our database setup. We have our models, we have our database. Now we need to start displaying these things. How do we display them? Well, we use the controller to decide what to display, and we use the view to actually show something to the user. Over here at the bottom, you see in your configure services method, there's something called routes. This is what defines what route we go to. So in our case, we're using localhost 5000, and then we're going to add more and more routes, and that's when the URL changes. So /home/ person / student / course, all of the things we're going to add. Now, this part here defines the template of the route. So what it's saying is that first it will look for the name of the controller, If it doesn't find a controller, it's going to go to home. Then it will look for an action inside, the name of an action inside that controller. If it doesn't find anything, it will go to index. And then you have an optional parameter of ID. So we're going to use that when we're editing courses or viewing details of a student or so on. So this is why these default values are why when you went to localhost 5000 you had something displayed, because by default it went to the home/index. Now let's go have a look at that home controller and its views. So in the controllers folder, you see there is one controller currently. It's called home controller. It always has controller there, it's by convention. But when you go to the root using the URL, you never include the controller part. And it has a whole bunch of methods in it. Now, what we're going to do for now is delete the about and contact methods and the error one. So delete those three, only leave the index one in. So we can concentrate on one thing at a time. Right, the index method is our default method in this controller. So because we set up our roots that way. And it returns a view. So iAction result, something built into MVC. And in our case, we're returning a view. Now if we look in our folders again, we have a views folder. The views folder has these two views over here, view imports and view start. That's where the application starts. So we don't have to worry about those, we don't have to change them, that's been set up for us. We're going to leave those alone. The shared views is where you put, by convention, views that will be shared between different controllers. We're going to look at one of them just now. But for now, we're going to look in the home folder. So our home controller has its own folder inside the views folder, and it has views inside it. Because we deleted the about and contact methods in our home controller, we can also delete these two files. So we're going to delete about and contact from the views folder. We're only left with the index view. This view is quite complicated. You can open it up, select everything and delete it. We're going to make our own view. And all our view is going to have is a header, and it's going to say, welcome to UFS. Now, you'll see that these files are CS HTML files. So C# HTML files. They're also known as razor pages, and what makes them different from normal HTML files is that you can actually write C# inside these files. And we're going to do that a little bit later, not right now. But let's leave everything up to this point and hit the play button again to make sure we haven't messed anything up. Alright, so all we put on our page was a header, but we still have a menu at the top here, and we still have a little footer at the bottom. Where is that? Well, that's in the shared section. So, if we have a look in the shared section, there's a view called layout.cshtml. So that's been set up to be our main layout of the page. Now, in this layout over there, this tag, this render body is the very important part. That's the part that takes all of the other views you create and puts it into this specific layout. Okay, so all of this other stuff on this page is everything else you see, and then that header gets put inside over here. So there's that copyright thing at the bottom, and here over here is our menu. So you see it's a unordered list of items, and it has 3 items, but we've deleted these two. So let's get rid of them in our menu because we don't need them anymore. Now if we rebuild, you'll see that only the home one is left. So we're going to leave the home controller as is, and we're going to actually create our own controller. So with general CRUD methods in MVC, you usually create a controller per class. So we're going to start off with creating our course controller. So in the controllers folder, we're going to add a new file and call it course controller.cs. Now, our course controller will be in the namespace course management.controllers, because it's in the controllers folder. And it's going to be, again, a class, and it's going to be called course controller. All controllers inherit from something in MVC called controller. Again, it doesn't have the using reference, so we're going to use the light bulb to add it. And it comes from MVC, because that's where our controllers come from. Now, we need to provide our controller access to the database. And we do that like this. So we define a private read-only field of type course context, and you add the using reference. And this is just a naming convention, but usually when you create private fields in C#, you name them with an underscore and a lowercase letter. That's why it's underscore context. And then we pass it to the constructor of course controller and set this private field to the one we're getting in our constructor. Now, this is called dependency injection. Dependency injection is a whole separate thing that Rory is going to tell you more about tomorrow, so I'm not going to spoil it. But now, in our constructor, we have access to our database context. Now that we have our course controller, we're going to create a default method in our course controller. Now, what was our default method called in the home controller? Index, correct. So it's going to be a public iActionResult index. It's not going to take in any parameters. And inside here, we're going to retrieve our courses from the database. How do we do that? By using the context. So we're going to create a variable called courses, and we're going to say underscore context dot courses dot to list. So the to list will be underlined because we need to add something else to our Unix, and that something else is called system.link. This is something that's a part of C# itself, not specific to .NET or .NET Core, and it helps us take the database set that we create in our database and convert it to a list. We don't have to worry about doing that part, it will do it for us. And now, in this method, we also need to return a view. So we're going to return a view with the same name as our action, but we want to pass our courses to that view so that we have access to them in our view, so we can display all of them. But now we don't have this view, so if we build now, things would break. So let's create it. In our views folder, we're going to create a new folder and call it course. Inside the course folder, we're going to create a new file and call it index.cshtml. Alright, and now this is where the razor syntax is going to come in handy. We're passing our list of courses to the view, and to access that list of courses, we have to define them as a model at the top of our view. And the way we do that is using razor syntax. Razor syntax is an @ and we're going to say @model and say that we're expecting a list course. Visual Studio tries to be clever, but delete that last part. Now that we have our course in there, we can actually display it. First, let's make the page a little bit pretty, right? Let's add a header and say horizontal rule. We're going to create a table and give it a class of table. So this is something that's part of Bootstrap. It's going to make our table look pretty. We're going to create a header for that table. So with a table row and table headers for name and level. Those were our two properties on course, right? And now again, we want to we want to go through each course on our list and put it inside. So what we're going to do is say again, because we're going to be using C# for each. And we're going to call it in model. So for each of the items that exist in our model, which is our list of courses, we're going to do the following. We're going to create a row, and we're going to create, again, two columns. And in our columns, again, we're going to use something from C#. And it's called @HTML dot display 4. So this is going to take the name of each row and display it. Now the reason we're accessing it like this with HTML.display4 is because there are certain settings that you can set on your model so that it displays differently. So say for example you have a decimal or a date that you want to display and you want to format it a certain way. Then what you would do is you would use the model properties to display it in that way. So you would specify the format inside your model. And then we need to create the other column. Should we try build and see what happens? Make sure no one has any errors.
Anyone need help?
If we haven't done anything wrong, we should be able to, after localhost 5000, put a / and type course. Hit enter, and we have an empty table. Right? Because we have an in-memory database that doesn't have anything in it. So that's why we have an empty table. So let's fix that problem, right? Let's add some things to our database. So let's stop here. Close this thing. So at the top of our table over here, just underneath the horizontal rule and just before the table, we're going to add a paragraph and then an anchor tag with an ASP-action called create. And this part here will just say, will just be what's displayed inside the anchor tag, which in this case will be create new. So our ASP action is saying that in this controller that we're using, we're going to be to have a method or an action called create. We don't yet have this, so if we build this now, it will break. So we need to make this create method. Did everyone add the anchor tag? So now we're going to go back to course controller, and underneath the index method, we're going to create a new method called create. What is create going to do? Well, it's going to open a new page where we can create a new course. So we're going to create a new course that we're going to pass to the view. And then we're going to return the view, passing in the course. Now in our views course folder, we're going to create a new file, call it create.cshtml. This view is also going to have a model, but this view's model is not going to be a list of courses, it's going to be just a course. And then again, just to make it consistent, we're going to add an H2 with create course and then a horizontal row. Then we're going to use something called a form. The form is also going to have an ASP action, and it will be called save. And inside that form, we're going to use a div to specify that our form will be a horizontal form. So this is another part of Twitter Bootstrap we're going to be using to make it display nicely. And then over here, the first thing we have is a hidden input. And it says that it's for the ID. So we don't want the user to be able to say what the ID should be of the course. The ID will get automatically assigned. But in order to be able to know what that ID is when we're saving the form, so in our case, we're creating currently, but later on when we want to edit a course, we need to keep track of what the ID is. Now we need to put in our other inputs. So we need one for name and one for level. I'm going to cheat a little. So we create a div with a class of form group, and first we put a label that will be for name, and we're adding some classes to it, and then we put another div with the actual input for name, and at the bottom here, we're adding in something for validation. I'm going to show you how we're going to use that in a few moments. But the important part here is this input with the ASP-4. So in our case, we only have strings at the moment. So it will just put text boxes where you can type strings. But if you have a number or a date or I can't think of anything else right now, but it will put the correct input for that type. So it will put a number box only or a date box, so you can't type in a string in a number. So it helps you a little bit with that. And we're going to have this exact same div. So I'm going to just copy and paste it and replace all the names with level. Now we can create courses. Although our form is missing one thing. Who knows what our form is missing? A button. That's it. Good thing I remember. So again, we're putting it inside a form group with a few classes to make it pretty. And the type of the button is submit. So because it's inside a form, it will execute whatever the action of the form is. So the ASP action equals send. The value is just what it's going to say inside the button, and then some classes to make it look pretty. Now that's great, but what happens when we click this button? At the moment, nothing, because we don't actually have a method to handle what happens when we click this button. So we need an action called save in our controller. So we go back to our controller, and over here we're going to create a new action called save. But in this case, this is not just a normal action like all of the other actions we've been using so far. So far we've only been using HTTP GET. So HTTP GET is what you do when you want to receive information, right? But in this case we're posting information. So we need to tell the controller that this method must receive information from the view rather than the other way around. And we do that by using an attribute at the top of the method called HTTP post. And now we also need to specify what this information is that we're going to be expecting from the view. So we could just say course. We're expecting to receive a course, right? But the better way to do it in .NET Core MVC is to specify exactly which of the values you are expecting to receive. So this prevents things like overposting and posting data that isn't required. So if you are only editing certain things, you wouldn't specify them in this list. You do that by an attribute on the course, and that attribute is called bind. And the ones we're going to receive are the ID, the name, and the level. Now we want to also check that this course that we're receiving is actually a valid course. But there are certain things that are already built in for us which we're going to use to make sure that the course is valid. So let's open up our model again. So if we go to models course, the ID we're going to leave alone because that's an auto-incrementing ID. We're not going to change that. But we want both the name and the level to be required fields because we don't want people to leave them out when filling in the form. So all you do for that is just type required. And again, little light bulb and add the using statement. That would make that the validation trigger. So if you push the submit button and the fields aren't filled in, you'll see an error message. Let's add one more validation in here and say the minimum length of level will be 3. Using these attributes, you can also specify custom error messages. So if you don't want the default ones to be displayed, so the default one for required is this field is required. But if you for some reason need to specify a different error message, you can do that using these same attributes. Now that we have these on our course model, in our controller we need to check whether our model is in fact valid. And that comes from our base class controller that we're inheriting from. And all we have to do is using an if statement say model state dot is valid. So if our model is valid, what are we going to do? Add it to the database, right? And to add it to the database, all we have to do is call our context again. .add. And inside here, we're going to pass that course. Once we've added a course to our database, we need to return back to the list of courses so we can see that course, right? So we're going to use something called redirect to action. And the action we want to redirect to is the index one. One part I missed. So we've added the course to our list of to our database set of courses, but we haven't actually pushed that to the database yet. So we have to call context.save changes, and that pushes these changes that we've made to our database. So that's great. If we have a course, we've added it to the database, we redirect to the action. But what do we do if our model is not valid? We want to go back to the same view and show the errors. So we're going to return the view, but in this case it's not the same view, right? Because this view's name is create, while this method's name is save. So we need to go back to create and also pass in the invalid course. Before we test this, let's add the edit as well, because it's very similar, and then we can try it all out and see where people need help. So to avoid code duplication, so if we had an edit in a separate view, it would look pretty much exactly the same as this, right? Because we'll need the exact same input fields. To avoid code duplication, in .NET Core MVC, we use something called partial views. So partial views are useful because you can create certain things and pass models between them and reuse them multiple times. You can create partial views like our layout view, which is actually a partial view, which we're reusing multiple times. You can create them that are, so that they're specific to a controller, also that they're shared between multiple controllers. Generally, the convention for naming partial views is to have an underscore in front. That's just a naming convention. You don't have to stick to it. It's completely dependent on your team or the people you work with. So inside the views course folder, we're going to add a new file, and we're going to call it underscore save.cshtml. At the top of underscore save, I'm going to define that same model again. Model course. And then what I'm going to do is go back to the create method and take this entire form and put it in save instead. And now in create, I can call at html.partial Then here I need to name the partial. Because it's in the same folder, I don't need to specify anything besides _save. And I also want to pass the model that create has into the save method. Now that we've changed our create, we can easily add the edit field. To add the edit, inside our index page, we're going to add another column with an edit link. So in our header, we'll just add an empty column, or let's call it actions. And here we're going to add another column. This column will be an anchor tag. Its ASP action will be edit. And we also need to pass which item exactly we want to be editing. To do that, we're going to use something called ASP-root-ID. And in here, we're going to pass item.id. And that's just going to be the text that's going to be displayed. Now again, we have an action without a method in our controller. So we go back to the controller. And add a action called edit. But in this case, we're passing an ID to our edit method. Now we retrieve our course with that ID, and then we'll pass it to a new view we're going to create, which is going to reuse the same save partial view. So in this case, our var course will also use link, but it's going to use something from link called first or default. And here we're going to pass in a lambda expression to find our first item. So we want the course where the ID is equal to the ID that we're getting in our method as a parameter. Now, what first or default does is it will look inside your list of items or your database set for the first item that matches this criteria over here. If it doesn't find one, it will return null. So we need to make sure that it doesn't break if someone just types in some random ID. And the way we do that is with a little if statement. It says, if course is null, then return not found. So what this will return pretty much is a 404 to the user. Otherwise, if the course is found, we want to return it to our view. Oh, small c. C# is case sensitive. Very important. Okay. And now we need our edit view. Our edit view will look pretty much exactly the same as our create view, except it will say edit course instead of create course. So again, in our views course folder, we're going to say edit.cshtml. I'm going to copy everything from here into here and change that to edit. Again, if I haven't made any mistakes, this should work. Let's have a look.
I know what you're doing.
Let's just make sure that up to this point works on everyone's machines, and then we can add the last bit, which is the delete. So the create new link is there. We click on it. It loads our form. If we click save, it should give us an error. If we fill it in, click save, have a list. If we edit, we have an error. Okay. Didn't read my script, so I missed the part. So what we're trying to do now is save something with the same ID into our data, push it into our database again, because we didn't fix the save method to cater for editing. Right. So how do we do that? Well, what is the difference between creating a new object and having an existing one? So if the object already exists, it has an ID that's defined. So what can we check over here? If course.id is less than or equal to, it shouldn't be less than 0, but it's always safe to check. We want to create the new course. Else, we want to edit the existing course. How do we edit the existing course? Get it out of the database, change all of the things inside it, and save it again. So context of courses. So this is the exact same as how we were retrieving the course, except this time we say course.id. And then we change the name. In terms of building large enterprise applications, you should never do this part inside your controller. This part where you're actually updating your course. This is, for demo purposes, you can do it here, but you would usually do that somewhere behind the controller. The controller should only get things from the view, send things to the view. It should never actually do any of your business logic. And then we need to update the course inside the context. You think that fixed all our problems? I really hope it did, because I don't know what else I could call. People were shaking their heads.
Something else is going to be where you do it again.
Okay, go through it. So we can create a new course. And let's check if we can now edit this course. Here we go, we can edit this course. So one thing that's actually missing over here is we should be checking the ID over here as well. Because if we were creating, we want to go back to the create view. If we were editing, we want to go back to the edit view. To delete, in our index, we're going to add another link. It's going to be pretty similar to the edit link. I'm just going to separate them with a pipe so we can see. But it's going to be actually pretty much exactly the same thing as this. I'm just going to copy it and just change this to delete and this to delete. And now again, we need to create a view for the delete to confirm, because you always want to ask, are you sure you want to delete this? So, pretty much exactly the same as this edit method, right? Because we still need to get the whole thing. The only difference is that it's going to be called delete. Now, you probably wouldn't be copying and pasting this in a real world, but there'll be a lot of the code that would be shared between different methods, so you would extract it into a private method and call it from the same method. But to save some time, I'm just going to copy and paste it. Okay. Then we need to add our delete view. And again, our delete view will expect a model called course, or of type course. It will have a header called delete course. We'll have a horizontal rule, and it will also have a form. The form's action in this case will be delete. It will have a hidden field for the ID again, so that we can send it back so we remember which item we're trying to delete. And then actually these MVC tutorials are the first place I have ever seen that uses a data list. So who here has ever used a data list before? Okay, maybe I'm wrong. I usually use unordered lists or ordered lists. But anyway, alright. So our data list will have the details of our course so that we can remind the person what they click delete on, so in case they change their mind. So over here we're going to use at html.display name 4. And then that will display the name of the name field. And display 4 will actually display the value. Okay, I'm gonna just copy that and add one for level as well. So the reason I'm using display name 4 and display 4 is because I can now go to the model over here and say that levels required field, levels at display name needs to be something else. And that's what will get displayed over there. Right. Once we have the details of what we want to delete, we want to have some buttons confirming what we're going to delete. We're going to have two buttons. Again, a submit button, so that we can submit our form. And then we're going to have another button, or in this case, an anchor tag that says cancel. And what this cancel button will do is it will just go back to the action called index. Now we need to implement our post method. And it's also called delete, right? And now again, we're going to be passing the whole course. But now this is where that bind attribute comes in useful. Because in order to delete something, we don't technically need the entire course. We just need the course's ID. So we can use bind and just bind the ID. That way not the entire course will get passed back to the controller, just its ID. And then to delete something, all we do is call underscore context dot courses dot delete, right? Dot remove. But we have to pass a full course, so we have to get that course in. So just go to and then the last thing we need to do is figure out what action we want to go back to after we've deleted the course. And what action would that be? Back to the list. And that's it. Our whole course section has all of its CRUD methods. Now, one other thing you could do here is add it to your menu, so you can get to it easier, so you don't have to type it in. You do that by, again, in the shared views layout. Here's your menu section, which currently only has home with its index method. So the menu specifies the controller and the action you'll be calling when that menu item gets hit. So for the course one, you would go to controller course and action index again. Just rebuilding one last time, make sure everything worked. Right. Now, that last section I went through quite quickly, and I know a lot of you weren't following. So we'll probably be here for another 10 to 15 minutes if anyone wants to ask any more questions. But if you need to go, feel free. We are also here tomorrow, so you can ask us questions then again.